Wonderful. Thank you.
Great. Well, ladies and gentlemen, a very hearty welcome to you all. It's wonderful to see you here. My name is Irving Finkel. I have the job of introducing our distinguished speaker, Cyprian Broodbank. I'd just like to say that I'm a curator in the British Museum in London, and Cyprian here used to work at University College, which is about 4 minutes walk away from my office, and I never met him before until 5 minutes ago in Jaipur. And it's a very great pleasure. So that, I must say, is a marvellous tribute to the pulling power of literature. Now, we're in line here for a remarkable treat, because this book, whose title goes as follows: The Making of the Middle Sea, A History of the Mediterranean from the Beginning to the Emergence of the Classical World, is a subject which no other person on the globe would even think of writing a book about, because its span and the range of subject material, the length of time and the geography involved are the most extraordinary rich challenge. And the book, a mere 750 pages, is something that everybody should read with intelligence and attention. So I'm going to give the floor to our speaker, who's going to give you a PowerPoint, an illustrated talk about this, but I would just like to say that I thought of a good title for Cyprian. I think he should be regarded as the cosmic giant piano teacher, because he operates on a vast scale and begins with Middle Sea.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's an immense pleasure and honor to be here. I'd like to thank Irving, my recent acquaintance from across the road in Bloomsbury, for his more than generous introduction, and to all the organizers of this stupendous festival for the invitation and for quite spectacular hospitality. I'm going to start a long way out and focus in. We live today on a largely blue planet. Can you all hear me at the back, by the way? Is the microphone working? Excellent, thank you. I fear we may not be able to. If we can't, I'll talk you through the maps if you can't understand, if you can't see them clearly from that range. We live on a blue planet. 71% seawater by area, and rising. But our histories of it, until recently, have been far too green and brown. Of late, that's begun to change for the last 500 to 1,000 years. Maritime or ocean history, a new thalassology, has rectified this for the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, the Chinese and Pacific Seas, over the last half millennium or so. Now, from that point of knowledge, one could do two things. One option is to look forwards, over the cusp of the present and into the future, and this is where I find out whether this wonderful machine works. It does. To look forward to the next 10 or 20 years, for example, in the seas of south and east of China and adjacent nation states, where sea lords set out during the recent age of Western hegemony confront far deeper time and more ineffable Chinese claims. This, of course, one of the hotspots for where World War III may or will break out. One could go further into the future and think of oceans that at the moment we can hardly dream of. The great Arctic Ocean that is being opened up by global warming. The New North, as it's been, down we go, I thought something would happen. Those of you under 40 in this audience will probably have the opportunity to take a cruise to the North Pole, which, before you crack open your champagne upon arrival, I suggest you contemplate the deeper meaning for our planet of what that possibility will mean. But even today, if you look at the number of ships stopping at a port like Archangel or Anchorage, It's doubling pretty well every year. We are creating new oceans, and indeed, it's these new oceans that will diffuse attention from areas like the South China Sea. Are we likely to get any pictures back? Fantastic. I'll plow on regardless. I'm sure you can all imagine your map of the world, and soon we'll get back to rather sort of smaller and more focused areas. Because today what I'm going to do is look in the other direction, not into the future, but from the perspective of deep history. A deep history accessed through an archaeology of a data omnivorous kind. And I think there are three reasons why this kind of deep archaeological history matters. One is it gives us an awareness of the rootedness of maritime propensities in our species, among human beings, across time and space. Secondly, unrelated in a sense, it shows us the deep foundations of many of the patterns and problems that emerge into the light of more recent, traditionally defined history of recent centuries and today. And thirdly, I think it encourages us to think differently about the messages we derive from history. A history not of empire and state, of ethnic boundaries and difference. A history of networks, a connective history, a reticulate one if you like, and a more deeply tolerant history for all of us. We move on. In fact, if one thinks back into evolutionary time, oceans have been important to how we came into being from hundreds of millions of years ago. The new biogeography is producing some very interesting patterns in the evolution of monkeys. And here I had a very nice picture of all kinds of very pretty South American monkeys, but you can imagine what they might look like. We've long known two very basic things about this part of the world. Firstly, that South America and Africa used to be tectonically joined. The great bulge of Brazil fitted into the bite, if you like, of Benin and the arc of West Africa on the one hand. We knew that. And we knew that every monkey living in South America today is descended from an ancestor living in Africa. For a long time, the most parsimonious and obvious reason to explain that is when South America and Africa were sundered, the monkeys went with them and differentiated with an ocean between them. Nice and easy. Wrong. Because the genetic clocks are now producing a very, very interesting result. Crude as they are, disputed as they are, it is more or less beyond doubt that the South American and the African monkeys diverged genetically after the Atlantic began to open. They transferred across a narrow precursor of the great ocean that separates America and Africa and Eurasia today. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that monkeys develop boats. It didn't mean they meant to do it. But getting across the sea has been a very deep time pattern in our ancestors' evolutionary history. And this continues into the world of early hominins and early human dispersal. Most of the way in which we got around the planet, our ancestors got around the planet, were largely terrestrial. But we see some very interesting and striking short-range exceptions. One of them, probably the most famous, comes from the island of Flores in Indonesia, where something just under 1 million years ago, Homo erectus, one of our direct ancestors, managed to get across a water gap of probably 15-20 kilometers across a line called Wallace's Line, which is one of the great biogeographical dividers between the animals of India, Asia, Southeast Asia on the one hand, and the marsupials of Australia. By 50,000 years ago, plus or minus, our direct ancestors, Homo sapiens, had made it to Australia itself, across a barrier of something like 60 to 100 kilometers. That's impressive. They'll have been doing that on dugout canoes, on little bits of wood. That's a long way. And of these deep time perspectives, the one that amazes me most, it gives me goose pimples, is a little tiny island in Melanesia called Manus. About 14,000 years ago, somebody got there. We know that because they dropped some black volcanic glass that could not have come from that island. The distance to the nearest land was about 270 kilometers, and the middle 90 of those were blind in terms of crossings. You couldn't see where you'd come from, you couldn't see where you're going to. Still gives me goose pimples. That's a long time ago. Now, all these opening examples, I think, are very interesting in terms of what we think of now as J-curves, the little first flips of propensities that have taken off and skyrocketed over the last few hundred or thousand years among our species. They're propensities going back well into our evolution and our hardwiring as people. But today what I want to focus on is the last few thousand years, the few thousand years that form the world that we all together share and live in today. And I'm going to be starting by looking at the world's three great oceans, just before the dawn of our penultimate millennium, before about 1000 AD. And at this point, it would be really nice to have some pictures. But I don't think we're going to get them. The funny thing about this is, Irving and I were spending the last half hour working out whether this was in fact a PowerPoint presentation or not, and we decided that it most definitely was. How wrong could we be? It may yet become one. It's fine, we can paint the pictures in words. Let's start in the Pacific. 40% roughly is the ocean of the world's surface. About 2,500 years ago, people, having invented a sailing technology, an outrigger canoe technology, began to break out of Melanesia and into the outer Pacific, reaching places like Easter Island, New Zealand, and Hawaii by the early years of the Christian era. We now know, incidentally, that they also got to South America. We know that for two reasons. South Asian chickens that originate in this part of the world, turn up in middens in archaeological sites in Chile before Columbus. They went that way round rather than the other way round. Sweet potatoes, a South American domesticate, rocket back across the Pacific on the return voyages of these canoes. I hope you're starting to get the message. Connections across this planet are not a privilege of recent times. They're not a privilege of complicated state-level societies and empires. There's something we've been doing on a small scale, socially, but ambitiously, spatially, for thousands of years. That Pacific pattern has become fairly well established and it's been fairly well known for 2 or 3 decades. The remarkable area, and I'm not just saying this because of the audience, is the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean has long presented riddles that we are archaeologically only beginning to engage with now. And when people come up to me as an archaeologist and say, why do you do this? Surely it's all been dug up by now. Well, Irving will show how it hasn't tomorrow in his talk, and I will try to present a similar argument today. One thing that we've long known that has looked very strange indeed is that if you look at a language map of Africa, you get a mosaic of African languages over the continent, and then one differently colored blob on Madagascar. The languages of Madagascar are Austronesian. They come from Southeast Asia, Melanesia, and Papua. They crossed the Indian Ocean at least 1,800 years ago, and possibly earlier. We have no archaeological signature of that whatsoever, but it happened. Another goose pimple moment, for me at least. A whole global scale process that we've yet to identify. That linguistic hint was for a long time the only one we had. A few years ago, some other extraordinary evidence started to emerge, and it emerged from the humble banana. Yes, I did say banana. The banana is a native domesticate of Papua New Guinea and surrounding islands. All our bananas come from there, originally. Banana remains have started to pop up in West Africa, on the other side of the continent, more than 2,000 years ago. They, like language, cross the Indian Ocean. We have a linguistic, archaeological, genetic, biogeographical challenge of global scale to challenge us to address over the coming years. And the funny thing is, in contrast to all this, the Atlantic is the easy one, the late one. We make great play of Atlantic civilization over in Western Europe and in America. But the Atlantic before Columbus is the empty quarter. It's the emptiest ocean in the world. We have Viking expansion across the northern edge from about 1000 AD. We have people in the Canaries, we have people in the Caribbean from the other side. We even have people on Martha's Vineyard, which amuses American audiences no end. But we have no transatlantic civilization before the Columbian moment. Well, how did this oceanic world begin? The thesis I want to propose today is the places we need to look at are the world's little inner seas, the closed-off seas mainly around the rim of Eurasia, but not exclusively. Places in the sense that we might think of as voyaging nurseries, safe places for people to learn, to cross between islands, between peninsulas, to get used to adapt to this kind of, in a sense, completely inverted way of living not with the land, but with the sea. I now have a map that shows those various inner seas. The Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, the Bay of Bengal, the seas of South and East China running up to Japan and indeed beyond, and the great island world of the Caribbean. Doing that kind of comparative deep history runs into immense issues of unequal exploration, as we'll see in a minute. People need to be looking to find stuff, and people need to be looking intelligently. But there are also great challenges of actual preservation. In Southeast Asia, connecting into the Indian Ocean world, think of the great precious markers of trade in later times. Scented wood, spices, the feathers of birds of paradise, sea cucumbers. By not having the PowerPoint here, you've been saved a particularly disgusting picture of sea cucumbers. Or rather, if you like those kind of things, they're very tasty and delicious. I find it difficult to quite get there myself, but that's simply my cultural narrowness, probably. The point is, those kind of markers of luxury trade, going back probably several thousand years, are archaeologically invisible. How do you dig up a feather, a sea cucumber, a scrap of wood? If you're lucky, you might find a seed of a spice. Equally, not all these seeds are behaving evenly. An early version of this talk I gave in Hawaii a few years ago to an unexpectedly large audience of Caribbean archaeologists had me leaving town and in fact flying to the next island a few hours afterwards, because Caribbean archaeologists, New World archaeologists, love to talk about their part of the world as the Mediterranean of the New World. The conundrum that I started to realize that is indeed the case from a few generations after Columbus. The Spanish bring in all kinds of fairly unpleasant ideas about how you use islands. Slavery, cash cropping, trade. They bring those ideas nurtured in the old Mediterranean on the eastern side of the Atlantic, and they turn the Caribbean, in a sense, to a New World Mediterranean. Go back before Columbus, and the pattern is very, very different indeed. And in fact, the particular picture that offended so many people is a map of the Mediterranean and a map of the Caribbean with the islands removed surgically in the way one can now do with PowerPoint in both cases. And the point is, it's very difficult to imagine the deep history of the Mediterranean without islands. It's actually quite easy, or rather the challenge in the Caribbean is to say, would the prehistory of the Aztecs, of Florida, of the Orinoco Delta, in fact be very different if the intervening islands weren't there? And the challenge is, the answer, as far as I can see, is it may not be that different. Even in Western Eurasia, these inner seas are not all working in quite the same way. Baltic historians of the Baltic area of Northern Europe, love to talk about the Baltic as the Mediterranean of the North. And as a couple of my Mediterranean colleagues have rather acidly put it, no one returns the compliment. The Mediterranean is never known as the Baltic of the South. We do have, however, some excellent areas where rich archaeology combined with early writing can give us a very rich idea of how these inner seas came into being. One of them, which it's a great shame there isn't a slide of, because we really do nothing about these slides. They were working fine before. Is there nothing we can do? Hello? Is there nothing we can do about the... Oh my God. Oh, I'm so sorry. Well, in which case, we're all in the same boat. So if you want pictures, you can't... If you want to leave this talk halfway through, you're very welcome to, but don't leave in search of better pictures elsewhere, because there are none across the entire festival. I'm reliably informed. Not at all. Not at all. Not at all. Excellent. Tantalizing. Tantalizing stuff. Yes, you can all see the Mediterranean here, can't you? No, I can't either. What you really have to hope is when Irving gets you reading cuneiform tomorrow, that you have a slightly better...
You mustn't make jokes. Otherwise, I warn you, if the slides start from the beginning, you have to start all over again.
Well, this is such a well-informed audience, we can rock it through the first half without a minute. However, I am in fact going to proceed. We're now, if any of you thought perhaps you were at the wrong talk, going to focus in on one of those inner seas, one of the most richly evidenced we have, the world of the Mediterranean, where I've been conducting my research and writing for the last 20 years, and where, in a sense, a depth of tradition of archaeological and ancient historical exploration, a combination of land and sea, allow us to explore how this sea became stitched together socially, technologically, but also cognitively, as the idea of a Mediterranean from way, way back in time. Now, the very funny joke on me at this point is, at this stage, there is a slide showing the Mediterranean, but also with a long quote from Lawrence Durrell, which I can't remember verbatim, and it's up there on the screen, but it's not. It's from page 4 of Balthazar, and it goes roughly like this. The Mediterranean, I may even have it right now, it's coming back. The Mediterranean is an absurdly small sea. The length and greatness of its history make us dream it larger than it is. Great purple words from Lawrence Durrell. And I think that's about right, actually, or whatever. The length and greatness of its history make us dream it larger than it is. How self-evidently true. To pour some cold water on the Mediterranean's aggrandizement, it is slightly less than 1% of all the sea space on the planet. And yet how much we talk about it. What big fat books we write about it from Brodel onwards. None of them less than 700 pages as far as I can make out. 650. Let's also think about some properties of the Mediterranean. And here it would really be nice to have some pictures, but I'll try to draw them out. Firstly, it is a unique space on this planet in one demonstrable respect. It is, by most counts, the world's largest inland sea. And secondly, it's one of only 5 tiny patches of this planet that have what we call and define technically as a Mediterraneoid environment. And that's a very specific and very challenging kind of environment. It's hot and dry in the summer, it's wet and rainy in the winter. It is incredibly unpredictable. If you're farming in that environment, you have no idea how much rain you'll get next year. Too much, too little, the wrong time, the right time, on a microcosmic scale. It is risky and full of opportunity. It's a perfect nursery, if you like, for someone like Odysseus. Risk, advantage, the unknown, the wily, the clever, the flexible. Okay? There are 5 Mediterraneanoids on this planet, and these ones I can remember because if you think about where your wine comes from, go to an off-license, as we call them in England, the Mediterranean, California, Chile, southern patches of Australia, and the Cape of Good Hope. Those are the 5 Mediterraneoids, and that, in a sense, is the 5 places where wine viticulture has taken off during the globalization of the last few centuries. Map those onto the inner seas around the world, and you get one, and precisely one major overlap. And that is our Mediterranean. It is a very special and strange place. There is one tiny, tiny second area of overlap. And if any of you get this, I'll be deeply impressed. Any guesses? Los Angeles, Southern California, and particularly the Channel Islands and the maritime seaways between them, but on a tiny, tiny scale. Secondly, the Mediterranean, this is very funny, at this point I have a note saying properties various. Here you see the various properties nicely illustrated on the screen. That would have been my prompt. Various properties, particularly the sheer length of coastline. If you unravel the length of the Mediterranean's coast, that interface between the world of the land and the world of the sea, it is 46,000 kilometers long. Rather like unraveling the intestine of a blue whale. It goes on and on and on. It would take you most of the way around Africa, that length. And that means that you have a very crenellated coast, a coast where amphibious behavior, if you like, comes naturally and is suggested from a very early stage. We have prodigious data. It's not simply the fact that we've been digging for a very long time, partly because of the great classical tradition that emerges later there, but also we have different kinds of data. We have some of the earliest writing anywhere in the world. We're lucky to be on the edge, the periphery of Mesopotamia and of Egypt, which from 3.5 to 3,200 BC start to produce a continuous written tradition that starts to talk about the edges of the Mediterranean world from a very early stage. We have a fantastic, in a sense, world of imagery, as you can see. And we also, because of the extremes, the violent extremes of climate, have extraordinary archaeological preservation through heat and cold, dryness and extreme wetness. We have the oldest shipwrecks in the world on the one hand. We have the papyri of Egypt on the other. We have volcanic Pompeiis and prehistoric Pompeiis through fire. From ice in the Alps, we have the Iceman. I don't know if the Iceman is well known here. He's what I think of as a high altitude shipwreck. He's a very unfortunate chap who 5,200 years ago went for a walk for unknown purposes. There are many theories, some of them deeply prurient, some of them more prosaic. He went for a walk high in the Alps and never came back. And ironically, as a result of global warming, he was spewed out of a glacier about 15 years ago, intact with his entire kit. He's actually about 200 meters on the wrong side of the watershed to be a Mediterranean man. But science is pretty good now, and archaeology is even better. We can tell from the pollen in his clothing that he had walked up from the valleys of northern Italy. He was a Mediterranean man, deeply lost in the mountains. So extraordinary wealth, vignettes that we capture through a variety of ways. From now onwards, what I want to do is, in a sense, show you how with a rich archaeology like this, we can make sense of the deep history of how we went to sea in one part of the world, in the Mediterranean. Before we begin, we can think in a sense of a series of phases as things get more and more ambitious and complicated and connected. But before that, let's start with what I like to think of as phase 0. The long 2 million years during which people have lived around the shores of the Mediterranean, at least in Africa, and from about 1 million years ago, slightly more, in Europe and the Levant, probably earlier in the Levant. For much of this period, the Mediterranean appears to have been more a divider of people than a uniter. If you look at the patterns by which our ancestors got around that sea, they went round rather than across it most of the time, probably not all of the time. And one of the great indicators of this is that wonderful close other of ours, the Neanderthals. When I was first invited to come here, William Dalrymple was very keen that I talk entirely about Neanderthals, and I've been sending desperate emails saying, I don't know much about Neanderthals. There are people who can tell you a lot more about Neanderthals than I can. What I know is everything in my book, and that's about 5 pages. Are the cameras on, by the way? I probably shouldn't have said that. But anyway, Neanderthals are actually extremely interesting. As many of you will know, they're a species of human, extremely like us. In fact, all of us who are Eurasians have between 2 and 5% of Neanderthal DNA in us. Neanderthals emerge about 400,000 years ago out of a common ancestor that lived north and south of the Mediterranean, in Africa and in Europe, a species called Homo heidelbergensis. He didn't go to Heidelberg, nor did she. The names are strange, as we'll come to. The Mediterranean divided between them led, in a sense, to the emergence over time of 2 species through lack of contact. The Neanderthals in Europe, our direct ancestors, Homo sapiens, in Africa. The Neanderthals are very interesting. They lived for longer in the Mediterranean than in any part of their distribution. It's a fluke, in fact, that the first Neanderthal skull was not found in the Neander Valley of southern Germany in 1856, as is commonly believed. It was found in Gibraltar in 1848. A few years earlier, 1848, as some of you may know, was a year of political and social revolution in Europe, rather than one in human evolution. They were put in the bottom drawer and forgotten about until it was too late to name the species Homo gibraltarensis, which is what they really should be called. Neanderthals, the last ones went extinct in southern Spain, probably in contact with our own species, or just before our own species moved into that part of the world. The Neanderthal story is a deeply and intimately Mediterranean one. But so far, not much seagoing, not much seafaring here. When did people start to go to sea? How do we know? This is... We're going to move forward to about 13,000 years ago. One of the nice things about doing archaeology is you get to throw away big figures like that. We've zoomed forward several tens of thousands of years, 13,000 years ago. The Ice Age is almost about to end, the last Ice Age. Writing won't be invented, even in his part of the world, for another 9,500 years roughly. How do we know people are going to sea? We know because we find things on islands that were definitely islands even then, that could not have got there in any other way. And they're 2 particularly beautiful examples. We find shards of a sharp black volcanic glass. It's a material, a kind of super flint, that we call obsidian. We find this. Most of the outcrops they all come from volcanoes. Most of those volcanoes are on islands, they're island volcanoes. We find them on the mainland of Greece. The only way they can have got there is by human transport. Obsidian actually is a lethal stuff. If any of you end up handling it, do be careful. It was used as a razor, even once they'd invented the Bronze Age, because it's sharper than bronze. I once had the experimental job of shaving one of my graduate students with an obsidian razor. It was extremely sharp, such that his face looked extremely unpleasant. Aha! There I am. And there is a slide from long, long ago. Yes, you can there's Gerald. Oh, did I get it right? Yeah, I think I did. There's some Neanderthals, there's some Phoenicians. The Mediterranean's unusual, the Mediterranean. The Iceman at the top, not looking very well, coming out of the ice after 5,200 years. The Mediterranean is very interesting. It's still even more interesting. Some Neanderthals. And here we are. The red dot up there shows the earliest discovery of obsidian from one of the Cycladic islands, the island of Milos, the same island that later produced the Venus de Milo. And the other dot off the western end of Cyprus is another discovery of human beings arriving on Cyprus and doing something very unfortunate indeed, we think. Because at the same time that the human beings arrive, these rather cute pygmy hippopotami, and indeed pygmy elephants, very cute idea. I love your elephants, but these elephants would be about that tall. They are actually dwarf descendants of the Indian elephant, whose range at that stage extended to Syria and the coast of the Mediterranean. They were being hunted there by Egyptian pharaohs and Assyrian kings many thousands of years later. Some of these, whatever. Some of these actually swam to the island of Cyprus a very, very long time ago, and because the island is small and there were no predators, they became dwarfed, rather as the dodo lost its power of flight. Anyway, these poor species, lost to the world now, vanish at around the time that people arrive. That would have involved 65, 70 kilometers of crossing of open water to get to Cyprus. It involved island hopping for several weeks down the Cycladic Islands to pick up and to find this stuff, this black volcanic glass, and get back to the Greek mainland. Why did people do this? Well, the timing is very interesting, and due to the improvements in radiocarbon dating, we can now tell exactly how these first endeavors at open sea travel in the Mediterranean match with what global climate is doing. Look at the bottom plot. It's not very easy to read, but can you see some wild zigzags and a red circle? Yes? That's all you need. The wild zigzags should make you very, very scared. They are global climate from 18,000 years ago until the present. Top up is warm, down is cold. You start off with a lot of zigzaggy cold, yeah? That's the last ice age. It then gets very rapidly very warm. Yeah? Can you see that? That should be the beginning of our own Holocene age. In a way, it kind of is. We call it the Burling-Alarod Interglacial, as we like to call it, things like that. But it's the beginning of what should be our own age. As you can then see, something goes horribly wrong, it becomes very cold again, and then it gets warm again to the right of the circle. And that enormously fast increase is the beginning of our own Holocene age. What we fondly give a separate age in climate history, the Holocene, now to be succeeded by the Anthropocene, as many people would argue. You should be frightened about two things on that map. Firstly, both the increases are increases of between 3 and 5 degrees of temperature within 50 years. I don't really care if their climate change deniers out there now. That happened twice with us, our ancestors, trying to cope with it. What's even more scary is why it goes wrong the first time. Because what happens is as the ice melts, the great ice caps over Western Eurasia and over North America, as the ice melts, it creates an enormous lake of cold water over much of Canada and northernmost America, the tiny fragments of which are the Great Lakes that survive today. That great icy lake piles up. There's a great dam of rubble separating it from rushing down the St. Lawrence Seaway. The dam breaks around 13,000 years ago. The ice water rushes down the St. Lawrence. It hits the Gulf Stream. It closes down the Gulf Stream for 1,000 years. Gulf Stream looking a little bit wobbly today. It got closed down then. It sent the whole of northern Eurasia straight back into the Ice Age again. World population then, roughly 4 or 5 million. Less than Jaipur today. Okay? Trouble. That's why archaeology is interesting. It is highly relevant to understanding the kind of predicaments we're in. But what I find interesting with today's topic is actually people start to go to sea ambitiously in the Mediterranean, not in halcyon days with easy waters, but in very dangerous, starkly different times. This is an adaptive strategy. It's a strategy of finding new places to live as the world around you changes. That short-range propensity to cross between the islands and the straits of the Mediterranean regularly is, in a sense, broadcast during the great emergence of farming in the Near East, and it spread right the way across, starting about 9,000 BC in the eastern Mediterranean, 8,200 on Cyprus, 5,500 in Spain. One of the great agricultural expansions, and the eastward lobe of that, of course, is the lobe that brings wheat and barley and sheep and goat to this part of the world. So it's a great booming outwards from the Fertile Crescent over several thousand years. What I find interesting about that map is that you can see that it's not a circum-Mediterranean process, it's a trans-Mediterranean process. It's going right the way through the heart of the peninsulas and islands. It's as if you've turned a coat inside out. Previously, The water was a blank bit in the middle, and you worked your way around the edges. Now, the water is beginning to become the communicative artery, okay? And the rim becomes the periphery. And that is where we've been, in a sense, ever since. The next inflection we see is about 5,000 years ago, 5.5, maybe 1,000 years ago, much the time that these geezers in Mesopotamia are starting to stick these little bits of wood into clay and starting to write. We see a series of things going on. We see people going to very remote and very obscure islands. We see people drawing boats for the first time. And remember, people don't draw boats to help us. They draw boats because boats are significant to them. 5 minutes, whoa. That's what comes from having to describe your maps as you go along. Let's fast forward a little bit. A new, much more self-conscious idea of seafaring. Seafaring as glory, as ideology, as challenge. In a sense, the birth of the world of Odysseus. You'll skip that one. The sail, a great shrinker of distance, and the only way in which you can actually break through the barriers of human muscle power to move huge quantities of stuff around. Probably emerging in Egypt, in the Nile Delta, just before 3000 BC. If I had a little more time, I'd tell some very funny stories about that. The one on the left is a slightly embarrassing story for the British Museum, so I'll pass gracefully on and get us onto these marvellous illustrations from 12,000 splendid of great bifid mast sailing ships coming into anchor, and on the bottom a half-sized reproduction of an Egyptian Bronze Age boat. A friend of mine was involved in this and sent me an email about it February a few years ago, and the email was entitled "What I Got to on My Summer Holidays." And I kind of thought, oh, well, it'll be the usual kind of sordid pictures of people on a beach partying. And I clicked it, and it makes your heart sing. It's basically a reconstruction of one of Hatshepsut Pharaoh's boats, sailing, in fact, in this case, down the Red Sea. These ships expand across the Mediterranean, shrinking space and bringing the world together as never before. On the bottom there, the world's earliest shipwreck, 1330 BC off the southern coast of Turkey, 10 tons of copper, a ton of tin, a myriad other imports from all over the Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. We'll pass on that because you can't see a thing. What one can start to do with archaeology is to use the evidence we have to bring together, to map over time. Top left, before 6000 BC. Top right, 6000 to 300 BC. 3000 to 200, bottom left. Up to 1300 BC, bottom right. The yellow dot in the Black Sea has nothing to do with me. Phoenicians, the people who in traditional history stitched the Mediterranean together, are in fact not a cause, but a consequence of thousands of years of knowledge, experience of seafaring around the Mediterranean world. I'm going to end with 3 very different slides, however. You can use traditional archaeology to understand how the Mediterranean came into being. You can also use Musculus domesticus, the common house mouse. It's a marvelous cipher. The house mouse evolved coevally with domestication and with us settling down into villages. They're like sparrows, they need to live with us. If you plot over time the emergence of the house mouse and its spread, it is a cipher for growing connections and contacts across the Mediterranean. One of my favorite house mice is, if I can find the PowerPoint, middle map on the right-hand dot. That house mouse was a mouse unfortunate enough to get onto the world's earliest shipwreck just before it sunk. Extraordinary. From the micromorphology of the mandible of the mouse, that's a good phrase to say, the micromorphology of the mandible of the mouse, said it again, you can show that particular house mouse was of the subspecies that only existed in northern Syria. And so that boat had a few days earlier been in one of the great ports, Ugarit, in all likelihood, one of the great literate writing ports of the Eastern Mediterranean, had hopped on and has now become the most famous mouse in prehistory. To get back to one of my opening proposals, however, a more tolerant, networked, and open kind of history. This is the kind of history that Mediterranean archaeology teaches us, not the kind of grid of ethnic, timeless determinants that are locked onto this. A history of meetings, connections, fluidity, and flux. And I want to end up with this magnificent work of art, in fact, by a Japanese artist, Yukinori Yanagi. It's an extraordinary creation. It's a sand painting of the flags of the Pacific nations, intra-Pacific, circum-Pacific, and imperial, painted entirely in coloured sand between two sheets of perspex. That alone, over about 5 meters by 4 meters, is quite an achievement. But then what does he do? And this is a metaphor. He introduces colonies of living ants. The ants burrow into the sand painting. The colours blur, the outlines melt. New constellations, new colours, new flags. That, for me, is ocean and maritime history in the making. That, in a sense, is a message from the deep past for our planet today. That is a message where, whether in Southeast Asia, in the Bay of Bengal, or in the Mediterranean, we encounter these tragic events. We've been there. We've all been there for thousands of years. This is a connected planet. Thank you. Thank you. What time are we?
We have about 7-8 minutes for question answer.
Sure.
So shall we go around with the mic? Will you take some questions?
I'd be delighted and honoured to. Yes, please.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you so much for your presentation. I just wanted to ask, it was interesting to me that...
I'm looking for you, I'm so sorry. Yes.
It was interesting to me that until you brought up the Egyptian sail, you hadn't talked much about navigation and techniques of seafaring, and you were describing the movement of people around oceans and seas as almost like it was a force of nature. I was wondering if that emphasis was deliberate.
No, it's not actually, and in fact, that's a very, very good question indeed, thank you. I think there's a great distinction here between the origins of seagoing, which are almost entirely in areas where the distances are small, you navigate by sea marks, by, in a sense, accumulated mental maps of knowledge of what the next landmark or sea mark is, rather than by celestial navigation of the type that you need in the Indian Ocean, the Pacific, and such like. It's only we were talking about this actually a few minutes before I came on. Most of the Mediterranean is actually intervisible. If you map the little areas where you can't see land, they're quite restricted. So initially, it's all about knowledge and understanding, and the challenges are quite different. In oceanic navigation, entirely different. But there's some very, very interesting indications that from an early stage, this is a profoundly cultural process rather than simply people being blown around by nature. And the most beautiful example of that I know is the Pacific, where if you think about it, the expansion out of Melanesia, out of the islands north of Papua New Guinea, right out to Easter Island and to the New World, runs from west to east. And that is in the teeth of the prevailing winds that go the other way. And that, incidentally, for any of you who are of the Thor Heyerdahl generation, is why he thought the whole thing went the other way, that they came from South America, which they didn't. We now know that. I won't go into why, but we know they didn't. But actually, if you think about it, the reason is very sensible. Why would you actually head out directly into the wind if you're exploring a great ocean for other islands, rather than with it? You want to get home. You're not suicidal. You work against the wind until people say we've got 3 chickens and 2 days water left. Then you flip round and you can get back. And of course that is also how the knowledge network of where to look and where not to look is so successfully built up. So people are very intelligent about this, they're thinking about it. No, this is a cultural creation. Not with the monkeys, probably not with hominins, but certainly as soon as we're the actors, this is culture. And that is what excites me about the Indian Ocean, because as far as we can make out, those crossings of the Indian Ocean are not circum. They're not going around the edge. They're crossing straight across the middle, very early. And as you all know better than I, there are fewer islands in the Indian Ocean than in the Pacific. That's really quite an extraordinary thing. Please.
Hello. Yeah, here.
Sorry, I think
Yeah, good afternoon. How do you just feel that working on this researching topic of Mediterranean? It's a very interesting topic. So how you came on thinking on this, working on this topic?
How did I begin?
Yeah.
I'm going to be honest, because usually one has a pat answer that sounds as if one was born with this as a kind of intellectual dummy from the cradle. I began working on the archaeology of Mycenae, of Crete, of the Aegean. It's part of the kind of romantic inheritance of many of us as children. You read the Iliad, you read the Odyssey, you read the great stories of Schliemann, you become excited by it. As a child, I decided at the age of 18 I wanted to work in that part of the world. I worked for 20 years in the Greek islands. That began to make me think if you want to understand islands, you need to look comparatively. I started reading about Pacific islands, about Caribbean islands, Northern Atlantic islands. But at a certain point, and I think this is, in a sense, the crux point many of us come to, I started to realize that the frameworks of explanation I had within my world of the Aegean were not actually sufficient, that I needed to step back, partly because there were broader common denominators, and secondly, because I felt, and this is something that started to hit particularly with the great crisis of 2007, 2008, that we needed as archaeologists to actually tell bigger stories. The public out there was hungry for understanding how this planet was shaped, why it got into the predicament and the pattern it did. If we don't do it as archaeologists, others will do it for us. So I started to realize that big, deep history was important. And it mattered. My next project is going to be basically trying to take the Mediterranean example and look globally at how this pattern does in fact come into being.
Hello.
Yes.
I work on Indian Ocean, and I was intrigued by your reference to people from Southeast Asia going to Madagascar. Madagascar has a current from the African side which is against the hypothesis that a marsupial was crossing the two continents, the island and the... So would you like to elaborate anything on that? And the distances which were covered in those times.
All one can say is we have a great challenge because, as you know, the archaeology of the zoology of Madagascar and the botany of Madagascar is extremely unusual as well. In fact, people used to think that it was a kind of island fragment of the great southern continent we call Gondwana land, which was the great fragmented continent used to include Australia, New Zealand, New Caledonia, much of South America. That's not now so obvious. All I can say is the archaeology of Madagascar is well known from the arrival of the Arab traders. We can start to push it back a few centuries, almost to 0 BC. It's been very difficult to go back further, but we have this language pattern, and there's really no other way of explaining it. So what we have to understand, in a sense, a two-way process. We have a short-range set of interactions with the African continent, but we also have something trans-oceanic going on as well. And we do not understand, I think, the temporalities of that yet. And that's the kind of thing that makes me feel young and optimistic as an archaeologist. We have heroic challenges ahead of us. I think the genetics are going to be very, very interesting too, incidentally, when we get good ancient DNA on this problem. There's going to be a lot of interesting stuff to look at. I think there's another question.
Can we have a microphone here, please?
I think that will be the last question, and then we'll have to end this session.
Or you could come up to the front, and then I could hear you, and then I can give my answer through the microphone. I can then project the question to the audience. And,
very privileged to be the last question. I was actually wanting to know your opinion about something, and it got me thinking when I saw that the sand map, the sand flags, that sand painting, and the current refugee crisis that's happening based in the Mediterranean. Do you think that geopolitics has created boundaries in seafaring, especially in the current political environment. And if we go back to the metaphor, the ants are being stopped from traveling from one flag to the other and creating new entities. What would be your take on that?
That's a really, really good question. Excellent question. No, I think, and not just in the Mediterranean either. Yes, is the short answer. And I think regrettably, and I think what worries me deeply over the last few years is the creation, in a sense, I mean, the nation state is a young enough concept anyway. It's not a useful concept to think with over deeper time. It's an entirely unhelpful concept to think with through much of the archaeology I work with. It's particularly young in this form in the Mediterranean world. And I think what worries me is on top of that, we've created in the European Union something that was meant to be open and accepting and bringing people together, but in fact what it's creating is a larger, harder edge. And it's fascinating. I have colleagues, anthropologists and friends, who work, for example, on the anthropology of fishing communities in southern Sicily and in North Africa, opposite. And they have a completely different understanding, a certain distance and antipathy to their capitals, their nation-state capitals, back in the north and south, but a much more common understanding across them. And this kind of ancient Mediterranean flux is being artificially sundered and blocked by some very ignorant polemics over the last few years. So I find that very worrying, and I'm not as expert in what's going on around the Bay of Bengal and then across into mainland and island Southeast Asia, but I would expect again young nation states, in a sense, creating edges where forms of maritime contact that go back as far as we can look are precipitating out in what we call a refugee crisis. Does that answer your question?
Okay, Cyprian, I think at this moment I
I
must
think
regretfully
yes.
draw things to a close. I'd just like to say that I consider the delivery of a lecture of that range a tour de force, and to do it without the lecturer's guide most of the time is a grand tour de force. So I'd just like everybody to thank you.
Thank you.
Bravo, bravo.
Give them a big hand to Cyprian and Irving. It has been lovely, even without the PowerPoint presentation. Sorry for this technical glitch, but to our consolation, it was all over the venues. So thank you so very much for being here, and it was very, very informative. Thank you so much.